Hey guys, today we're diving deep into one of the most underappreciated aspects of the American Civil War, its forgotten tactics. The ones that were fought far from the shiny glory of the battlefield. You probably won't survive this. Well, not literally, but you'll definitely want to pay attention to the mind-bending twists of history you've never heard before. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, most people think of the Civil War in terms of epic, bloody battles like Gettysburg and Antietam, but the truth is there were a ton of other smaller, less glamorous fights happening in the background. These were the real, hidden forces shaping the war's outcome. From espionage to psychological warfare, it's easy to overlook these as mere footnotes in history. But trust me, these strategies were more than just an afterthought. They were critical to both the Union and Confederate efforts. One such tactic involved the use of espionage. You've heard of James Bond, right? Well, the spy game during the Civil War wasn't all martinis and high-tech gadgets. It was a dirty, gritty affair. Spies on both sides were sneaking around, gathering intelligence, and using it to cripple the enemy's ability to make decisions. Just like the movies, except without all the cool gadgets and with a lot more risk. The Confederate spy networks, for example, had a rather unglamorous but effective system of gathering intelligence. And sometimes it was as simple as a well-placed letter or a quiet conversation in a dark alley. Historians still argue whether espionage truly tipped the balance during the Civil War or if it was the more traditional battle strategies that mattered most. But one thing's for sure, a well-placed spy report could make all the difference. Think about it. If you knew where your enemy was going to strike before they did, wouldn't that give you a major advantage? As you settle into this war story, let's not forget the influence of weather on these events. No, I'm not talking about rain ruining your picnic plans. Weather, believe it or not, was a strategic tool used by both sides. Can you imagine trying to move your troops through a muddy field while your enemy is positioned on higher ground, taking advantage of the mist? Perfect setup for a surprise attack, right? Some of the most pivotal battles hinged on weather patterns, yet it remains a commonly overlooked factor in military history. The weather was so crucial that it was treated as a kind of battlefield in itself. For example, the Confederate Army, in particular, often used harsh weather conditions to their advantage, luring Union troops into ambushes. Historians still debate whether the cold and snow played a major role in the Confederate victories at places like Fredericksburg, but no one can deny that the weather was more than just a backdrop. It was a character in this grim drama. Guerrilla warfare in the shadows, all right, let's continue. Now, as we march forward, let's talk about something a bit more unconventional. You know how we all have that one uncle who never follows the rules, always looking for shortcuts? Well, the Civil War had its own version of that, a shadowy force lurking just beneath the surface, guerrilla warfare. You probably didn't know this, but some of the war's most significant disruptions weren't from grand battlefield confrontations, but from small, scrappy forces ambushing supply lines, disrupting communications, and making life downright miserable for both Union and Confederate forces. The Union wasn't the only side that had an advantage in manpower. They had something far more elusive, the power of these guerrilla tactics. These weren't your typical battle scenes. They were more like the kind of guerrilla warfare you'd associate with modern-day conflicts. Hit and run, sabotage, and surprise strikes were the name of the game. A group of Confederate irregulars could sneak into a Union camp, steal vital supplies, and vanish without a trace, leaving no time for retaliation. These guys didn't wear uniforms or fight on traditional battlefields. They blended into their surroundings, making them impossible to track down. Historians still argue whether these guerrilla units had a real strategic impact on the war's outcome. Some say they were merely a nuisance, while others believe they significantly tied up Union resources, diverting attention from larger, more critical fronts. Regardless of where historians land on this debate, one thing is clear. Guerrilla tactics introduced a level of unpredictability to the war that no one, not even the generals, could ever fully prepare for. And let's not forget the psychological warfare that came with this. Imagine being part of a massive, well-trained army, with thousands of soldiers under your command, only to be repeatedly embarrassed by a few local fighters using nothing more than their knowledge of the land and an unshakable resolve. You thought you had the upper hand, but you couldn't even control the supply routes? That messes with your head, doesn't it? It wore down the Union Army and made their commanders question whether they could win the war by just playing by the book. This guerrilla warfare wasn't just confined to the South, either. The Union wasn't entirely helpless in this department. In the West, Union forces utilized guerrilla tactics to disrupt Confederate supply lines, and it worked sometimes. The strategy wasn't foolproof, though. Despite all the successes, guerrilla forces could never quite secure a long-term win. Was it because of their lack of formal structure, or was it simply the nature of irregular warfare? Historians still can't seem to agree, but one thing is for sure: these shadowy forces caused some major headaches. So, next time you think about a grand, glorious battle, remember the smaller, scrappier confrontations that waged on the fringes. These unsung guerrillas made their mark, even if they didn't get the headline treatment. The Great Railroad Game now. Let's move on to something a bit more metal. And I don't mean the genre of music, but something literally made of metal: railroads. You probably don't associate railroads with battlefield victories, right? It seems like a stretch. But trust me, these steel beasts were just as crucial to the war effort as any cannon or rifle. In fact, the Civil War had its own railroad game, and it was a high-stakes game of chess played with miles and miles of track. The Union knew that controlling the railroads meant controlling supply routes, vital for moving troops, weapons, food, and even soldiers. The Confederacy, aware of this, set about trying to destroy as many Union railroads as possible, while also building their own. But things didn't go as smoothly as they had planned. The Confederate railroad system was plagued with issues: limited infrastructure, constant sabotage, and a lack of resources. The Union, on the other hand, had a well-oiled machine, aided by its industrial power. It was a railroad war as much as a battlefield war. Historians still argue whether the Union's superior railroad system truly decided the war. Some argue that it was logistics that ultimately won the war, rather than the raw battles themselves. After all, if you can't feed your army, you can't fight. And the North's ability to shuttle men and supplies quickly across long distances gave them a significant advantage. Railroads weren't just for carrying soldiers. They also moved weapons like cannons and artillery faster than ever before. Without the railroad network, the Union Army would have been seriously crippled. But it wasn't just about shuttling resources. The Confederacy, desperate to level the playing field, began focusing on derailing Union trains and destroying track infrastructure. Sounds like a classic game of sabotage, doesn't it? And in many cases, it worked. In fact, Confederate raiders, like John Hunt Morgan, famously used raiding tactics to destroy Union railroads, causing chaos in supply lines and forcing the Union to expend massive resources on repairs. Now, the question still stands: did railroads truly shift the balance of the war, or was it all just smoke and mirrors? Some historians believe the railroads were a nice-to-have, but ultimately didn't have the transformative power that some people suggest. Was it truly railroads that won the Civil War, or was it a combination of strategy, manpower, and sheer willpower? It's a point of debate that still lingers. So next time you think about trains, think about the Civil War, where iron tracks held the power to determine the course of history. The rebel use of cavalry, let's saddle up for this one, because we're about to ride through the untold story of Confederate cavalry. When you think of the Civil War, cavalry doesn't always come to mind right away, does it? We often picture huge battles with infantry and artillery, the kind of heroic imagery you see in movies. But let me tell you, the cavalry was where things got really interesting, especially on the Confederate side. The South's cavalry, though often outnumbered, became a tactical force that struck fear into the Union Army. But they weren't just used for standard skirmishes or as a quick-moving force. They played a much more complex role. Confederate cavalrymen like J.B. Stuart, for example, weren't just tasked with standard reconnaissance. They were masters of disruption. They would ride circles around Union lines, gathering intelligence and causing chaos at a scale that often went unnoticed. Picture this: You're a Union general, watching your troops in battle, and suddenly, a group of well-organized cavalry swoops in from the flank, sending everything into disarray. You're now on the defensive, not because of artillery or infantry, but because a few men on horseback threw off your entire operation. Historians still argue whether Confederate cavalry was as effective as it could have been. Some believe it was a wasted opportunity, a force that wasn't fully utilized. Was it because they didn't have enough resources? Or was it the strategy itself that didn't play out as well as expected? Regardless, the role of cavalry in the Civil War can't be dismissed. Their role wasn't just about swift attacks. They were also instrumental in disrupting Union supply lines and communications. But here's the kicker. By 1863, the Union began to catch on. They developed their own cavalry, led by leaders like Philip Sheridan, and used it to counter the Confederate advantage. These Union forces didn't just engage in skirmishes. They worked in tandem with other Union forces, blending cavalry and infantry strategies to push the Confederacy back. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for the Union either. The Confederates, always the underdog, relied heavily on their cavalry to keep up the pressure, especially in the West, where they excelled at mobile warfare. The debate over whether the Confederate cavalry could have turned the tide of the war continues. Could they have won key battles with better coordination and resources, or was their role ultimately limited by the Confederate Army's larger strategic failings? You can't help but wonder how much more effective they could have been if the South had put more stock into their cavalry's potential. So, next time you see a cavalry charge in a movie, just remember that these riders were far more than just dramatic moments. They were the ghosts that haunted Union commanders, quietly chipping away at their resources and their resolve. The mystery of the Pine Barrens battle, all right, hold on to your hats, because we're about to dive into a little-known battle, one that, if you blink, you might miss in history books. It's called the Pine Barrens Battle, but don't get too excited. This isn't one of those big, bloody clashes we usually hear about. No, this one is more mysterious, more elusive, like a ghost in the fog of the Civil War. Imagine this. You're deep in a swampy, dense forest where the air smells of pine and wet soil. You can barely see your own hand in front of your face because of the thick mist swirling through the trees. Suddenly, you hear the sound of rustling in the bushes, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. You've stumbled into the Pine Barrens, a forgotten battlefield that no one really talks about, but that may have played a significant role in shaping the course of the war. Historians still argue about the true significance of the Pine Barrens battle, and for good reason. This battle wasn't fought for grand strategic reasons or to claim a key location. It was fought because both sides had forces stationed there, and things went south rather quickly. What's even stranger is that, despite its importance at the time, it seems to have been almost entirely erased from the collective memory. Some argue that it wasn't even a battle in the traditional sense, but more of a small, chaotic skirmish where nothing much was gained or lost. The weird part, both the Union and Confederate forces claimed victory, and you can imagine how that left everyone scratching their heads. It's like that one argument where everyone insists they won, and you're stuck trying to figure out how exactly that happened. In some ways, this battle was a microcosm of the entire war, messy, confusing, and difficult to pin down. Historians still debate whether the Pine Barrens battle truly impacted the war's outcome, or if it was just another minor clash between overextended forces. Was it a tactical genius move by one side, or was it simply a waste of resources? No one can say for sure, and that's what makes it such a tantalizing mystery. And here's where it gets even stranger. The details of this battle were hidden for years, buried in the swamps of history, only for occasional rumors and scraps of documents to surface later, leaving us with more questions than answers. Could this be the Civil War's best-kept secret? Well, probably not, but it certainly gives us a glimpse into the small-scale chaos that was happening in the margins of the war, battles that were never meant to be remembered, but that had their own strange impact on the outcome. Next time someone brings up Pine Barrens, you'll know exactly what to say. Yeah, I know all about that mysterious battle. And you'll sound like a Civil War expert, even if no one really knows what happened there. The Battle of the Weather, a tactical advantage now. Let's talk about something most people don't immediately think of when it comes to war: the weather. But guess what? In the Civil War, weather was like the ultimate wild card. If you've ever tried to organize an outdoor picnic and had it ruined by a downpour, you can appreciate how important weather can be. Except imagine that downpour ruining the strategy for an entire army. Yeah, that's the kind of impact we're talking about here. The Confederate and Union armies didn't just battle each other on the field. They had to contend with the unpredictability of nature. And let's be honest, weather was often the unsung hero of battles, influencing outcomes in ways that no general could predict. Take the Battle of Fredericksburg, for example. One of the major reasons the Confederate forces were able to hold their ground wasn't just because they had superior tactics, although they did. It was because the Union forces had to slog through freezing rain and mud, making it nearly impossible for them to advance as planned. The Union Army was exhausted, and the weather was a force they couldn't defeat. Historians still argue whether the weather was an unintentional ally to the Confederacy or if they actually used it to their advantage. The North had the sheer manpower, but sometimes, as it happened at Fredericksburg, the weather proved to be the great equalizer. You see, weather didn't just act as a backdrop. It became a full-fledged factor in military planning, or lack thereof. And let's not forget that fog and smoke from artillery often concealed the enemy's position, adding another level of tactical advantage. Imagine being on the battlefield, staring into a wall of smoke, not knowing whether your enemy is 5 feet away or 5 miles. This kind of uncertainty created opportunities for sneak attacks and quick strikes. It wasn't exactly weather-controlled warfare, but Mother Nature definitely played a role in making those strikes more effective. Of course, it wasn't all one-sided. The Union Army, with its industrial might, was much better equipped to deal with the elements, at least in terms of logistics. For example, they had better clothing and equipment to withstand the cold. The Union Army even built winter quarters that allowed them to survive the harsh conditions, while the Confederacy, already strapped for resources, struggled to maintain their soldiers' morale during particularly brutal winters. But when it came to critical battles, weather could still throw the whole strategy into chaos. Historians debate whether battles like Fredericksburg would have turned out differently had the weather been in favor of the Union. Would they have pushed through with fewer casualties? Or was the Confederate victory more a result of poor Union planning than anything else? Weather might have changed the tide of the war, and no one truly knows to what extent. So, as you sit inside today, cozy and warm, remember this. During the Civil War, weather wasn't just a nuisance, it was a tactical weapon. And sometimes that weapon made all the difference. Secret societies, the role of spy networks, all right. Let's step into the shadows for a moment and talk about something that sounds straight out of a spy novel: secret societies and espionage. When you picture spies during the Civil War, you probably imagine sneaky operatives in trench coats, passing secret messages under dim streetlights. And, well, you wouldn't be too far off. But there's an interesting twist to this story because espionage during the Civil War wasn't just about cloak and dagger secrecy. It was also about using groups of people, often linked to mysterious secret societies, to gather intelligence and sabotage the enemy. It was a complex web of spies, informants, and good old-fashioned trickery. On both sides of the war, secret networks flourished. The Union had its own spy system, famously organized by Alan Pinkerton, while the Confederacy used a less formal network, but with just as much cunning. These networks were made up of spies who often didn't have the official backing you'd expect from government agencies. Instead, many were civilian volunteers, regular people who found themselves in the right place at the right time and decided to get involved in something bigger than themselves. Some even operated within secret societies that were willing to risk it all to serve their side. The Confederacy's spy system, for example, was often unofficial and built on a network of covert contacts. But its most famous agent, the legendary Belle Boyd, ran rings around Union officers by charming them into revealing crucial information, only to pass it on to Confederate generals. She wasn't the only one. There were many women spies on both sides of the war, quietly gathering intelligence while operating under the radar. It's fascinating to think that some of the most impactful spy work happened without any grand cloak and dagger meetings, but rather through subtle manipulations in day-to-day life. Historians still argue whether espionage in the Civil War had as much of an effect as it's made out to. Some believe it was crucial, able to shift the tides of battle just by stealing plans or discovering an enemy's weaknesses. Others claim that it's overstated, pointing to the fact that many of the spies didn't always get the most valuable information, or sometimes they even fed false intel to their commanders. But the fact remains that spying was as much a part of the war as actual combat. These secret networks had the ability to cause confusion, sabotage supply lines, and disrupt entire campaigns without ever needing to fire a shot. What's even stranger is how disorganized many of these spy operations were. We're talking about disjointed networks, where people operated on their own, relying on nothing more than trust and word of mouth. They didn't have encrypted communications or fancy tech. Everything was done through code, dead drops, and good old-fashioned gumshoe work. And that's what makes their success so extraordinary. These covert operations were often as effective as the grand military strategies, pulling off some of the most successful sabotage missions of the war. So, next time you think about spies, remember that not all of them were secret agents in tuxedos with gadgets. Some were just everyday people doing their part to change the course of history, one quiet mission at a time. The art of defending a fort. The losing strategy, all right, time to talk about something that sounds straightforward but turned out to be a tactical disaster. Defending a fort. Seems like a solid plan, right? You build a stronghold, fortify your position, and wait for the enemy to come to you. After all, who wouldn't want to be safely barricaded behind walls and armed with cannons? But in the context of the Civil War, this classic military strategy often ended up being more of a trap than a triumph. Take the Battle of Fort Wagner, for example. The Union Army thought they had the perfect defensive position, well fortified, high ground, the whole 9 yards. But instead of the expected stronghold defense, it became a nightmare of poor planning, inadequate resources, and underestimating the enemy. The Confederates, on the other hand, were quick to realize that just holding a fort wasn't necessarily going to win the war. They learned quickly that breaking a fort's defenses or cutting off its supply lines could neutralize its entire strategic value. Historians still argue whether forts were ever a truly effective long-term defense strategy, especially considering how vulnerable they were to artillery and new tactics. The advent of rifled artillery and improved siege tactics made holding a fort a dangerous, if not impossible, endeavor. At Fort Wagner, Union forces suffered significant casualties simply because they failed to anticipate the speed and power of Confederate artillery. They were locked into traditional military thinking that forts were invulnerable, but in reality, they had become sitting ducks. But here's the twist. The Confederacy, despite its limited resources, often did better in fort defense, mainly because they had more flexibility. The forts that the South did manage to hold on to were often in less strategic locations, but they used them as traps to lure the Union into overextending themselves. The famous Fort Sumter, which became the symbolic starting point of the war, was eventually taken, not because it was a stronghold, but because it was isolated and poorly supplied. The longer you stayed in a fort, the more vulnerable you became. The battle for Fort Pulaski also illustrates this point. The Confederate Army, entrenched inside the fort, believed their defenses were impenetrable. But Union forces brought in modern rifled artillery, which completely altered the balance of power. The Confederates inside the fort were forced to surrender, as their defenses couldn't hold up against new technological advancements. This wasn't the grand defense they envisioned. It was a major strategic failure. Historians debate the exact reasons why forts became such a poor defense strategy over time. Some argue that it was the evolution of artillery technology. Others say it was a result of poor strategic thinking on both sides. Regardless of the reason, forts turned out to be less of a strategic advantage and more of a liability. By the end of the war, both the Union and Confederate armies realized that being locked inside a fort was no guarantee of victory. So, next time someone tells you to hold the fort, you can remind them that it might just be the worst advice of all. The high stakes of military deception. Let's step into the world of misdirection and clever ploys, because the Civil War was full of smoke and mirrors. No, we're not talking about literal magic tricks or fancy stage performances. We're talking about military deception, one of the most underappreciated yet powerful strategies of the war. Imagine trying to outwit your opponent not by brute force, but by making them think you're doing one thing, when in reality, you're planning something entirely different. That's the art of deception, and during the Civil War, both sides were masters of it. One of the most famous examples is the use of feigned retreats. This was a tactic used to trick the enemy into thinking a force was retreating, only to turn around and launch a surprise attack when they least expected it. Sounds like a strategy from a spy movie, right? But it was a real thing. Take the Battle of Chancellorsville, for instance. General Robert E. Lee famously used this tactic when he made it appear as though the Confederate Army was retreating. The Union, believing they had won, advanced, only to find themselves ambushed by Confederate forces they had thought were withdrawing. It was a brilliant use of deception that ultimately helped the South secure a hard-fought victory. But it wasn't just about feigned retreats. There were other methods of trickery that both sides employed, such as fake troop movements. This could mean anything from using dummies to creating the illusion of a large force moving in one direction, while the real army was sneaking around to another. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of these tactics in the long run, though. Some claim they were just small victories in the broader scope of the war, while others argue they played a major role in keeping the enemy guessing and disrupting their strategies. On the Union side, General Ulysses S. Grant wasn't afraid to use deception to his advantage. One of his most notable tactics was spreading misinformation among his troops, making it seem as though Union forces were in places where they weren't. This misdirection often left the Confederates unsure of where to strike, buying time for Union movements and giving them an edge in key battles. The psychological component of military deception was huge too. The mere act of making your enemy doubt their intelligence, second-guess their plans, and question their own forces was a powerful weapon. It didn't always result in large-scale victories, but it kept morale high on one side and low on the other. Soldiers are less likely to charge into battle with confidence if they think they're fighting shadows. Historians still debate how much deception truly affected the war's outcome. Could it have shifted major battles in ways we don't fully understand? Could certain victories have been avoided with a better strategic response to these deceptive moves? We may never know. But one thing is for sure. Deception kept both sides on their toes, adding another unpredictable layer to the chaos of war. So next time you're thinking about a battle plan, remember, it's not always about sheer strength. Sometimes it's about making your opponent think they got you figured out, only to reveal that you've been playing a completely different game all along. The lost naval tactics of the war now, let's set sail, figuratively of course, and dive in the naval side of the Civil War. While many think of the war as a series of land battles and military campaigns, naval warfare played an equally crucial role, though it often gets overshadowed by the larger, bloodier confrontations. The Union's superior navy, with its vast fleet of steamships and ironclads, was supposed to be a deciding factor in the war. But what people often overlook is how naval tactics, especially those that didn't work, shaped the conflict in unexpected ways. One of the most notable naval tactics was the use of blockades. And no, I'm not talking about the kind of blockade you might have read about in a textbook. The Union's blockade strategy aimed to cut off the Confederacy from vital supplies coming in from abroad. The idea was simple: prevent any Confederate ships from trading cotton for weapons and other goods, suffocating the Southern economy. However, the sheer length of the coastline made this strategy difficult to maintain. The Confederate Navy, which was smaller and less powerful, tried to counter the blockade with its own set of tricks. Enter the commerce raiders. These were Confederate ships designed to attack Union merchant ships, often sneaking past the blockade and wreaking havoc on the Union's trade routes. Confederate raiders like the CSS Alabama became notorious for their ability to outsmart the Union Navy, sinking merchant ships and stealing supplies. Historians still debate whether these naval tactics were truly effective or if they were merely an annoyance that delayed Union victory. Some argue that the commerce raiders did significant damage to the Union economy, while others claim they were just a small thorn in the side of a much larger war effort. But it wasn't all about sneaky attacks on trade routes. The use of ironclads, those heavy, armored steamships, was a game-changer in naval combat. The famous Battle of Hampton Roads, for instance, was a showdown between the Union's Monitor and the Confederates' Merrimack, or Virginia. This battle marked the first time ironclads faced off, rendering wooden warships obsolete. The result was a stalemate, but it was enough to demonstrate the future of naval warfare. Yet, despite the innovations, both sides struggled to figure out how best to use these new ships. The Union, for example, was initially slow to deploy its ironclads effectively, and the Confederacy had trouble maintaining their ships with limited resources. Historians still argue over the true impact of naval tactics on the war. Some believe the Union's blockade and naval supremacy were key to winning the war by starving the Confederacy of supplies. Others contend that the Confederate Navy's raids kept Union forces distracted, forcing them to divert resources from land operations. And then there's the question of whether the new ironclads were truly as revolutionary as they appeared, or if their impact was somewhat overstated in the grand scheme of the war. In the end, naval warfare was a bit of a mixed bag. It didn't win or lose the war, but it certainly kept both sides occupied, forcing them to adapt, innovate, and rethink their strategies. If nothing else, it laid the groundwork for future naval engagements, changing the course of military history for decades to come. So next time you think about the Civil War, don't forget to give a nod to those iron-hulled ships and the men who fought for control of the seas, because they were fighting a different kind of battle altogether. The psychological tactics of the war. Let's take a step away from battlefields and ironclads for a moment and talk about something a little less tangible, but just as powerful: psychology. If you've ever seen a team struggle to win after they've lost their morale, you know exactly how important a mental edge can be in any conflict. And in the Civil War, both sides knew that war wasn't just about strategy and weapons. It was about breaking the other side mentally. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Civil War was how both the Union and Confederate forces utilized psychological tactics to manipulate not just the enemy, but their own soldiers as well. And this wasn't just about using propaganda or keeping morale high. It was about mind games on the battlefield. Imagine being a soldier, standing in the heat of a battle, knowing that the slightest mistake could be your last. Now, imagine you've been told over and over again that you are part of a cause bigger than yourself, that victory is just one battle away, and that your side is unbeatable. That kind of belief can make a soldier feel invincible, or at least willing to fight a little harder. Take, for example, the Union Army's use of the March to the Sea during General William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous campaign. It wasn't just about physically advancing through the South. It was about breaking the will of the Confederate civilians and soldiers. Sherman famously employed tactics of total war, burning crops, looting towns, and destroying railroads. While this devastated the Southern economy, it also had a profound psychological effect. The Confederate soldiers, knowing that their homes and families were under attack, began to lose heart, with many deserting their posts. This wasn't just about supplies. It was about attacking the very spirit of the Confederate cause. Historians still argue whether psychological warfare was the deciding factor in the Civil War, or if it was just a byproduct of military actions. Some claim that the psychological toll of war wore down soldiers on both sides, contributing to the eventual collapse of Confederate morale. Others argue that it was purely logistical or tactical victories that paved the way to Union success. Regardless, one thing is clear: the battlefield was as much in a mind as it was on the field. Psychological warfare didn't stop with civilians. For example, Union leaders used various methods to keep their troops motivated, often emphasizing themes of liberty and patriotism, playing up the notion that their fight was for a higher cause, something that could keep soldiers going even when they were starving, freezing, and battling exhaustion. On the Confederate side, leaders like Robert, Lee used the image of a united Southern brotherhood, constantly reinforcing the idea that they were fighting to preserve their way of life. These mental tactics weren't foolproof, but they did provide a psychological edge that kept soldiers from quitting when conditions were at their worst. The impact of these psychological tactics is still debated. Could the Union have won the war without using such total war tactics to break Confederate morale? Would the Confederacy have held out longer had they been able to maintain their soldiers' spirits? We'll never know. What we do know is that both sides understood that the battle for the mind could be just as fierce as the battle for the battlefield. So, next time you think about the Civil War, remember this. It wasn't just about who had more guns or bigger cannons. It was about who could keep their mind in the fight when everything else seemed lost. After all, wars are won or lost before the first shot is ever fired in the head. Logistics or lethality? What won more battles? Now, let's get into the nuts and bolts of war, literally. When we think of battles, we often focus on the big moments, the charges, the heroic leaders, the bloody confrontations. But in the Civil War, some of the biggest victories were won or lost before the first cannon fired. It wasn't always about raw firepower or superior tactics. Sometimes it was about getting the right resources to the right place at the right time. Yes, I'm talking about logistics. Logistics might not sound sexy, but if you've ever tried to move across town with a flat tire, you'll get it. Imagine trying to move thousands of soldiers, along with artillery, horses, and food, across hundreds of miles of rough terrain. Throw in a few storms, some unexpected skirmishes, and the fact that the enemy is trying to stop you at every turn, and you've got yourself a logistical nightmare. The Union Army had the advantage here. Thanks to the North's industrial power, they had better access to supplies, railroads, and ships that made moving troops and materials much easier. The Confederacy, on the other hand, struggled with everything from railroads to food supplies. This discrepancy was a constant burden on the Confederate Army and is often cited as a key factor in their eventual defeat. After all, a soldier without food, ammunition, or proper equipment isn't much of a soldier. The Confederacy's inability to keep its soldiers properly supplied weakened their ability to fight effectively on multiple fronts. Now, historians still argue whether the Union's logistical superiority was the primary factor in their victory. Some say that lethal force, the number of soldiers and firepower available, was the deciding factor in key battles like Gettysburg. After all, it wasn't just about getting resources, it was about using those resources effectively when the time came. Others believe that the Union's logistical advantage kept their forces sustained long enough to wear down the South. Without the consistent supply of ammunition, food, and reinforcements, the Confederate forces simply couldn't keep up. But let's not be too harsh on the Confederacy. They knew they were outmatched, and they came up with some crafty solutions. For instance, they used their home field advantage to their benefit, utilizing local resources that the Union couldn't easily access. They also relied on guerrilla tactics and smaller, faster-moving forces to disrupt Union supply lines, which sometimes gave them the edge in battles of attrition. Despite all of this, the logistics battle was ultimately won by the Union. They had more men, more weapons, and more supplies, and they had the infrastructure to get them where they needed to go. The South, on the other hand, was like a car with a great engine, but no gas in the tank. Eventually, you're just stuck on the side of the road. The debate continues. Was logistics the real game changer, or did it simply complement the Union's overwhelming strength? Could the South have held out longer with better supply lines? Would they have won more battles if their troops were better equipped? It's a question that's impossible to answer definitively, but it's clear that the war wasn't won solely by the bullets and the guns. It was won by the bread in the soldiers' stomachs and the iron wheels of the trains that brought them their supplies. So, next time you're plotting a strategy, remember, it's not just about who has the biggest cannon. It's about making sure you've got enough cannonballs to keep firing. Logistics, my friend, is the unsung hero of warfare. The use of African American soldiers lets move on to one of the most complex and transformative aspects of the Civil War: African American soldiers. You've probably heard about the bravery of soldiers like those in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment who fought valiantly for the Union cause. But what many people don't realize is how revolutionary the inclusion of African American soldiers was, both to the war effort and to the broader American narrative. It wasn't just about adding more soldiers to the ranks. It was about redefining what it meant to serve and who had the right to fight for freedom. At the start of the war, African Americans were largely excluded from military service on both sides. The Union wasn't initially sure whether to let them fight, believing that allowing black soldiers would undermine morale or alienate border states still loyal to the Union. But by 1863, with the need for troops becoming critical and the Emancipation Proclamation in full swing, the Union began allowing African Americans to enlist. And boy, did they make an impact. Historians still debate the true effectiveness of African American soldiers in the Civil War. Some believe that they played a crucial role in securing Union victories, particularly in the South. Others argue that while their bravery was undeniable, their contributions were overshadowed by the racism and prejudice they faced, both on and off the battlefield. Either way, these soldiers changed the game in ways that go far beyond military tactics. The 54th Massachusetts, one of the first official African American regiments, stands out in history. They fought in the brutal assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where they faced heavy artillery and devastating losses. Their bravery was undeniable, and their actions became a symbol of the determination and courage of African American soldiers. But despite their heroism, they were still treated as second-class citizens by many Union commanders. They were paid less than their white counterparts and faced discrimination from fellow soldiers. And yet, they still fought with incredible resolve. But the Confederate Army? They didn't just recruit black soldiers initially, they enslaved them. At first, they were adamantly against allowing African Americans to fight. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the Confederacy had no choice but to consider the possibility of arming slaves. In 1865, as the Confederacy was crumbling, they passed a law allowing African Americans to join the Army. But by then, it was too late, and many argue that this decision came from desperation rather than a legitimate belief in their soldiers' worth. Historians still argue about the actual military impact of African American soldiers. Some claim that their involvement in key battles, such as the Battle of the Crater, was pivotal. Others point out that despite their heroism, black soldiers faced enormous challenges in terms of leadership, organization, and logistics. Were they truly integrated into the war machine, or were they simply exploited as a resource to fill gaps in the Union Army? What we do know is that the role of African American soldiers in the Civil War was nothing short of revolutionary. Not only did they play a crucial part in the Union's victory, but they also forced the nation to confront the deeply entrenched racism that had kept them on the sidelines for so long. The war couldn't have been won without them, and their legacy, one of bravery, resilience, and determination, has shaped American history ever since. So, next time you think about Civil War soldiers, remember this. The fight for freedom wasn't just fought on the battlefield. It was also fought in the hearts and minds of the men and women who dared to defy centuries of oppression. The tactics that never made it to the battlefields, sometimes the most intriguing aspects of war aren't the strategies that won, but the ones that never saw the light of day. In the case of the Civil War, both sides came up with some truly bizarre and ambitious plans that, for various reasons, never made it to the battlefield. Think of these as the what could have been moments of military history, grand ideas that sounded good in theory, but fell apart when put into action. And honestly, some of these tactics are so wild that it's almost a relief they never came to fruition. Take, for instance, the infamous plan to use balloon corps for aerial reconnaissance. The Union, particularly under the leadership of Thaddeus Lowe, experimented with hot air balloons to gather intelligence. These early aerial devices were meant to give generals a bird's-eye view of the battlefield and enemy positions, allowing for more accurate planning and strategy. Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, it was definitely ambitious, but not terribly effective. The balloon crews were ill-equipped for the harsh conditions, and the balloons themselves were often too easy to target, making them a dangerous proposition for soldiers who were already risking their lives on the ground. Historians still debate whether this tactic could have revolutionized military strategy had it been better executed. Some believe that the Union Army's use of balloons was just ahead of its time, while others argue that it was a failure from the start. Despite the initial enthusiasm, it wasn't long before the use of balloons was largely abandoned in favor of more conventional intelligence gathering methods. It's fascinating to think about how something so futuristic might have changed the course of the war. But in the end, it was just a novelty that never lived up to its promise. Then there's the idea of submarines. Yes, submarines in the 19th century, well before they became the high-tech war machines we're familiar with today. The Confederate Navy built the Hunley, a one-man submarine designed to break the Union blockade by sneaking up on enemy ships and planting explosive charges. While the Hunley did eventually sink a Union warship, it was a far cry from the efficient, stealthy weapons we think of today. The design was crude, the crew suffered high casualties, and the submarine was more of a death trap than a game-changing weapon. Historians still argue whether the Confederate Navy's use of submarines was a desperate last-ditch effort or a moment of brilliance that just didn't quite work out. One of the more bizarre strategies involved the plan to use hot air balloons and submarines in conjunction with each other. Yes, you read that right. Both the Union and Confederate forces toyed with the idea of using air and underwater vehicles in tandem for intelligence and sabotage. Imagine a balloon floating above the enemy while a submarine crept beneath the water, ready to strike. In theory, it sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. In reality, however, the technology of the time just wasn't ready for such a coordinated effort. So what does that leave us? Well, these lost tactics remain fascinating footnotes in military history. They weren't the strategic breakthroughs some hoped for, but they represent the imagination and desperation of the men who fought the war. These ideas never saw the light of day on the battlefield, but they showed that innovation wasn't just a product of military strategy. It was also driven by the hope that something new could tip the scales in a seemingly unwinnable war. Historians often debate whether these failed tactics were simply born from necessity or if they were genuinely groundbreaking ideas that would have changed warfare if they'd been more successfully implemented. Either way, these lost tactics are a testament to the creativity and innovation that fueled the Civil War, reminding us that even the most fantastical ideas can shape history, whether they succeed or fail. So, next time someone tells you that the Civil War was all about horses and rifles, remind them that balloons and submarines played a role too, albeit a brief and very strange one. The legacy of Civil War tactics in modern warfare, as we reach the final chapter of our journey through the lost tactics of the American Civil War, it's time to look ahead, way ahead, at how these long-forgotten strategies influenced modern warfare. I know, it feels like we've been stuck in the past for a while, but trust me, what happened on those battlefields in the 1860s has echoes in the military tactics we see today. In fact, many of the methods developed during the Civil War laid the groundwork for the strategies used in later wars, all the way to the present day. One of the most lasting legacies of the Civil War was the emphasis on logistics. Yes, we've talked about it a bit already, but this time, let's dig deeper. The Civil War was a turning point in the way armies thought about supply lines, transportation, and keeping their troops fed and armed. The Union's mastery of logistical support was a huge factor in their victory, and it shaped military operations for generations. The concept of moving massive numbers of soldiers and equipment over long distances became more advanced during this time, and modern armies continue to rely on the principles established by the Civil War to ensure success in combat. Take, for example, combined arms warfare, the idea that different branches of the military, infantry, artillery, cavalry, and even air power, can work together in a coordinated fashion. This wasn't fully developed in the Civil War, but the groundwork was laid. Think about how General Sherman combined the use of his infantry, cavalry, and artillery in his march to the sea. He didn't just rely on one branch of the military. Today, military forces around the world routinely combine different units to create the most effective fighting force. The Civil War was one of the first instances of this kind of integrated approach to warfare. Another key tactic that's still in play today is psychological warfare. The use of deception, misinformation, and morale-building strategies, which were crucial in the Civil War, is now a standard part of modern military operations. Whether it's through social media, media outlets, or direct psychological operations, armies have long since realized that the mental aspect of warfare is just as important as the physical. Think about it. The Civil War had its fake retreats and use of propaganda to sway public opinion. Today, similar strategies are used to manipulate perceptions of the enemy, mislead opposing forces, and bolster national morale. This is particularly evident in the information-heavy, media-driven conflicts of the 21st century. And let's not forget about guerrilla warfare, something that was crucial during the Civil War, especially in the form of Confederate partisan groups like the Bushwhackers. These irregular forces didn't face off in large-scale battles, but instead attacked the Union Army where they were weakest, often with surprise raids or sabotage. Fast forward to today, and guerrilla tactics are a common feature of modern asymmetrical warfare, used by groups all around the world against larger, more conventional military forces. The idea that a smaller, more nimble force can take on a much larger adversary, using speed, surprise, and knowledge of the terrain, was something perfected during the Civil War and is still relevant in conflicts today. Of course, technology has evolved since the days of cannons and rifles, but the core principles of these tactics haven't changed much. Even the use of balloon corps in the Civil War, despite its failure, was a precursor to modern aerial reconnaissance and drone warfare. The idea of gathering intelligence from above is now commonplace, whether through satellites or unmanned drones. While the technology has evolved, the strategy remains unchanged. Keep an eye on your enemy from all angles. In the end, the Civil War might seem like a distant conflict, but the tactics, innovations, and strategies developed during that time helped shape the way wars are fought today. The principles of logistics, psychological operations, guerrilla warfare, and combined arms tactics continue to play a huge role in modern military strategy. So, the next time you watch a modern war film or read about a contemporary conflict, take a moment to remember that many of the lessons learned from the battlefields of the 1860s are still influencing the wars of today. And that, my friend, is the legacy of the lost tactics of the American Civil War. From balloons to battlefields, from the psychological to the logistical, these forgotten strategies didn't just disappear. They quietly paved the way for the wars of the future.